Now, in episode 16, we discussed ways that you can help young children strengthen their fine motor skills before they ever use scissors. So if you haven't listened to that episode yet, I suggest you go back and listen now. In today's episode, we're going to focus on scissors and how to teach young children to cut with them. Now, it might make perfect sense to us as adults that first we strengthen their fine motor skills and then they'll be ready to cut with scissors, right? But what if I told you there was much more to it than that? You see, even those children who do have well-developed fine motor skills can struggle to use scissors if they haven't been presented with cutting tasks in the proper developmental sequence. Yes, you heard me correctly. When it comes to introducing scissors, we have to work smarter and not harder by teaching scissor skills in a way that takes into account how these skills are actually acquired. When we take the time to introduce scissor skills using the developmental sequence, we're setting our kids up for success instead of failure. So for those of you watching along, I'm going to demonstrate on the screen, but if you're listening, I'll talk you through it as well. So the first step in introducing scissor skills to young children actually does not involve using scissors at all. I know, crazy, right? So that first step is ripping. Now, your children will be much more successful if they practice ripping paper that's a little bit thicker than regular copy paper. It gives just a little more resistance and lets them feel how the paper will rip in their hands just a little bit better. So on the screen, if you're watching along with us, I'm holding some paper in my hands in between my two thumbs. I'm pinching the paper with my index finger. And you'll notice if I try to rip it with too much distance between my thumbs on the paper, all I do is I end up bending it, right? So I have to learn how to grasp it really close together with my thumbs close. And then I have to twist one hand away from the other. And then, and only then, can I rip paper. Now, the good thing about ripping paper is kids love to do it. They love to rip paper. And you can actually take a very quick informal assessment because you'll notice that children that have poorly developed fine motor skills really struggle to rip paper. So what that will tell you is that they're not quite ready yet to start with scissors, right? They need a lot more fine motor practice before they're ready. And so we have lots of opportunities for ripping paper in the classroom. It's something you can even do in your sensory bin, or you can give them tubs of scrap paper and they can just rip paper right over it. You'll also notice that they don't start ripping little teeny tiny pieces right off the bat. These little teeny tiny pieces only come later in the ripping process. So it's a process. We don't just give them a piece of paper and have them rip it and say, great, now we're ready to move on to the next step. It's going to take some time. You'll notice some kids will just rip maybe 2 or 3 pieces and say, I'm done. And a lot of times that's because their little hands are now fatigued from gripping the paper and twisting in 2 different directions. That was as much as they could handle, right? So we have to build up their stamina with ripping as well. So in the beginning of the year, I like to do lots of ripping activities. Crumpling is another good one. So you would take probably a full to a half sheet of paper and invite them to crumple it with one hand if possible. But with little children, that's really kind of stretching it. They're going to need 2 hands in order to crumple something. But that's another great way to strengthen those muscles in the hand, is to crumple sheets of paper. So that was step 1 in the developmental cutting sequence. And that step was ripping. Next up, we're going to talk about the second step. So step 2 in the developmental sequence of learning how to cut with scissors is snipping. Now, snipping is something that is fairly easy for your children to do if they can rip already and they have some fine motor skills. And my favorite scissors, because I know you'll ask, my favorite scissors are Fiskars for young children with a blunt tip. We never want to use the pointy tip with little kids for very obvious reasons, am I right? But Fiskars are kind of the gold standard when it comes to scissors for young children. It's just kind of like the debate between Crayola and Rose Art crayons. There really isn't a debate because Crayola is so far superior above Rose Art. The same holds true for scissors. So I always, always, always go with Fiskars blunt tip for young children. And one thing you can do now on the screen, if you're watching along with us on YouTube, I have a paper that has some dotted lines on it at intervals spaced across a strip of paper. And that's the most important thing. Now, you don't need the printable for this. You can do the exact same thing by using your paper cutter and cutting up construction paper into strips and then drawing lines on that construction paper with a Sharpie. But we all know that in today's day and age, a printable can save you a whole lot of time if you're not into all of that. So in this case, the child is just going to hold the strip of paper in their hand and they are going to open the scissors, and that can often be the biggest challenge, right? They're going to open the scissors wide enough to place the blade right along the edge of the strip of paper, and then they're going to close the scissors and cut through the strip. That's why we use a strip, right? We're snipping. We're just snipping, okay? And then they're going to move the paper, and they're going to do the same thing again, open and close. So what this accomplishes is practice with opening and closing the scissors. We're not worried about following a line. We're not worried about moving our scissors as we cut. We're not worried about turning the paper. We are simply snipping, one snip all the way through. That's our goal, is to make one cut, to cut through the line on the strip of paper. And again, this isn't just giving your kids strips and having them practice this one day. This is going to take many times of them practicing snipping. So in the beginning of the year, one of the things that I often do after we've done a lot of ripping into either dish tubs or a sensory bin is then to put out some snipping strips in the same format. So just like I put out paper for ripping, now I'm going to put out paper strips with those lines on them for cutting. One way I used to do it without a printable back in the day was I would cut the construction paper into strips, use my Sharpie, and I would do that. But another way is to draw the lines on a piece of white copy paper. So I used a ruler, drew the white lines on, and then I cut construction paper to size and I ran it through the photocopier, photocopying the lines onto the construction paper, and then I cut it into strips. That was a super time saver back then. Of course, now we have printables that accomplish the same goal. All right, so next up in our developmental sequence is fringing. Okay, so what is fringing and why do our kids need to learn it? So after they've mastered ripping and snipping, now we can have them fringe. And fringing simply means cutting to a point, right? So when it comes to fringing, I like to have a space on the paper for them that indicates where to put their thumb and where to grip the paper. So I'm using my thumb and my index finger to hold the paper in my left hand because I'm a right-handed person and I cut with my right hand. Now, if you were doing this with a left-handed child, you would want to put the thumbs up or some kind of sticker or something to indicate the thumb would go on the other side. And with fringing, again, we're going to practice closing the scissors to a point, right? Without continuing on through the paper. So this practice is opening the scissors and then putting them over the line. And then I have something at the end of the line to indicate that they stop. In this case, if you're watching on YouTube, I have little arrows to indicate which way they should cut the paper. When I did this with construction paper, I put stickers at the end of the lines that they're fringing. So I have this rectangular piece of paper in my hand, and it has 4 lines on it spaced equally across the paper. And those lines only go about 1.5 inches to 2 inches at the max into that piece of rectangular paper. And then the children are supposed to stop cutting, right? And that just means that it's a little bit more than fringing, right? I mean, it's a little bit more than snipping, right? But it's not cutting all the way through a paper just yet with multiple cuts. So it's just one cut. See, do you see how we're working up to cutting on longer lines and possibly shapes? So this is the developmental sequence of cutting, and this is step 3, which is fringing. Now, once your kids have mastered ripping, snipping, and fringing, then comes the hard part, and that is straight lines. Now, just in case you're wondering, when you introduce all these, I definitely spend a good portion of the first 3 to 4 months of school with pre-K 4-year-olds on ripping, snipping, and fringing, okay? And when it comes to cutting on straight lines, I probably, in my experience of 20 years in the classroom, I don't really start cutting on straight lines with multiple cuts until later, right? So no picture perfect, Pinterest perfect straight line cutting projects just yet. But when they're ready, when you notice that kids are ready, and they're all going to be ready at different times, there is no need to have your whole class ripping for 3 months when you've got a kid who came in already cutting. So you're going to be individualizing or differentiating your instruction. So you might have some kids who are cutting on straight lines in October, so even September. It just depends on their individual ability levels, just like it does with the alphabet and math and all the other things. So again, on the screen for our YouTube watchers, I have another rectangular sheet of paper. It has a place where the child puts their thumb. So they're pinching the paper in between their thumb and their index finger on the left-hand side, if they're right-handed, on the mark that you've indicated on the paper. And you can do that by putting a little sticker dot. You can use a Sharpie to put a dot there to let them know. The paper that I'm using has a little thumbs up to indicate that's where your thumb goes. And so they're going to start, and this one is a little counterintuitive for us as adults. You're going to start on the right side of the paper and work your way to the left, but that's because we're cutting closer and closer to our fingers. So we're opening and closing the scissors multiple times along a line to a point, okay? So this is going to require a lot more skill, okay? So you're going to have to determine when your students are ready for this, okay? And so we are just opening and closing our scissors and moving slowly towards the line. This is much easier said than done, okay? This can be a sticking point for a lot of children. They may be okay with ripping, they may be okay with snipping, and they may be okay with fringing. But when it comes to cutting multiple cuts on the same line and moving the scissors forward, right? As you cut on a line, you're moving your scissors forward. This can be so difficult for young children. And so what you often end up seeing with children who are not ready for something like this, you see wild cuts all over the paper, and it ends up getting just trashed. And sometimes there's ripping involved, and that's another telltale sign that they're just not ready. There's a lot of ripping that's happening because they're moving their scissors opposite. Instead of forward, they're moving them left or right, and you end up with ripping. You end up with big chunks. A lot of times, if they're really poor fine motor skills, you might also notice that their visual skills also are lacking, and they can't really see the lines. That's kind of an advanced thing too. So if your children are delayed at all, then you're going to definitely need to adapt to meet their needs. So that was straight lines. So we already covered ripping. That's step 1. Snipping is step 2. Fringing is step 3. And straight lines was step 4. And now comes something really difficult, right? So if you're in pre-K 4, this comes a lot later in the year for most children. Now, that doesn't mean that your children won't get there sooner or later. It just depends on their individual ability levels. And again, I have another rectangular piece of paper. You can use construction paper, or you can use printables like this. I used to just put zigzag lines on a piece of construction paper with a Sharpie, and that was what we did. And I would put a little sticker on the page to let them know where to grip it. And again, this is very complex because they're cutting a little to the left and a little to the right. So you see, we're not cutting a circle or a square yet. We're cutting one snip basically to the left, one snip to the right, one snip to the left, one snip to the right. So do you see how, if you're watching, as I do the zigzag cut, my wrist is turning to the left, to the right, to the left, to the right, and I'm making one cut each time. This is very tricky for children who are 4 years old, okay? Some would even say that zigzag lines are more for kindergarten than they are for 4-year-olds, and they would be right. So that means that we're not doing Pinterest perfect art projects or arts and crafts with our pre-K students, because we know the developmental sequence of cutting skills. And we know that making cuts on a straight line is difficult. We know that making zigzag cuts is difficult. So something to keep in mind. Now, after we've got the zigzag down, then and only then are your students ready to cut on curved lines. And this, my friends, is where so many teachers take a wrong turn. So listen up. If you have your kids or you present them with cutting circles and squares too early, it can be super frustrating for not only your students, but for you as well, because you're going to be putting out what I like to call scissor fires, meaning kids are cutting themselves, they're cutting each other, their hair, their clothes. They're acting inappropriately with scissors because they really don't have the skills to hold them in their hands yet, right? So we really have to take into consideration where our students are in their developmental stages of learning how to cut. And again, on the screen, I'm holding more of a square piece of paper here, but it has a circle on it, right? A dotted line circle. Now, I used to do this by tracing cups on construction paper and then using a sticker dot for their thumb. But on this printable that I'm showing you on the screen for our YouTube viewers, there's a picture of a thumb. And again, I'm going to grip that paper where that thumb is using my thumb and my index finger to hold the paper. And now I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to practice opening and closing my scissors as my hand turns the paper. This, my friends, is so difficult. Most all of my 4-year-olds in pre-kindergarten struggled with this. And do you see at some point I had to let go of the picture of the thumb because I had to keep turning the paper. Do you see how my hand holding the scissors never turned, but my other hand, in my case, my left hand, was turning the paper? So I've got one hand moving in one direction and the other hand making a completely different motion. That is almost like rocket science for little kids when it comes to their fine motor skills or their cutting skills. So difficult for them. So I would have probably a majority of my students struggled with cutting circles in preschool. Okay? So that is that step. So far we've covered ripping, snipping, fringing, straight lines, zigzag lines, curved lines, right? And the curved lines could be circles, they could be waves, they could be hearts, any kind of curvy line. And finally, we get to the right angles, right? Those are squares and rectangles. Now I'm going to cut this page in half for our viewers because I have 2 squares on my page here and we really only need 1. So again, I have a square piece of paper in front of me and I have that little thumbs up symbol to show the students where to put or to pinch the paper between their thumb and their index finger. And then I have a shape of a square on my paper, and it has a dotted line so the children know where to cut. And again, I have done this by tracing a block from my block center onto construction paper, all right? And here, the children are going to open and close on a line. So we're going and we're moving forward, right, as we cut. And now we've come to the end of the line. We have to turn the paper and turn the right hand. Do you see how it's different than the circle? Whereas my hand never moved with the circle. I have to move my hand a little bit here on the right-hand side. And now when I get to the end of that line, I have to do it again. And I have to keep moving my hands as I turn the paper. So difficult. I know, it seems so easy when we do it ourselves as adults, but it's not easy for young children to do at all. Now, one question I get asked quite often is, what if my kids just cannot hold those Fiskars scissors? They cannot open them, they cannot close them. It's just way too hard. And that's okay, because they make something that I like to call spring-back scissors or spring-loaded scissors, or whatever you prefer to call them. But they have a little spring. You can see I'm holding some. If you're watching us on YouTube, I'm holding a pair right now. And when I squeeze them closed, they bounce right back every time. So for those kids who have a difficult time opening the scissors, which is going to be a majority of them if you're teaching pre-K 4, then you're probably going to want to invest in some of these spring-back scissors, okay? Now, if you want to watch me cut them, if you're watching on YouTube, I can cut with them. So I hold them just as I would any other scissor. But as I cut the paper, it's just so much easier to do with spring-back scissors. There's so much less effort that you have to put forth, because actually opening the scissors for little kids is very difficult. So these spring-back scissors. We will also make sure that in the blog post that goes along with this episode, we will have a link to the spring-back scissors and the Fiskars scissors that I recommend. Now, another type of scissor you might consider, especially if you work with students with special needs, are loop scissors. Now, loop scissors don't have a hole for your thumb or your fingers. Instead, there's just a big loop at the end of the blades, and all the child has to do is squeeze the loop. Now, I couldn't find my loop scissors today. I do have a pair, but I couldn't find them. But this is perhaps one of the easiest ways to teach children how to cut first, is with the loop scissors if they just squeeze them, and they're often used to help children with special needs. So when children are introduced to scissor skills in the correct sequence, in a way that honors how they physically develop these skills, then they'll be much more successful. Now, what I noticed in my own classroom when I started introducing scissor skills this way is that I spent a lot less time putting out scissor fires, right? I spent a lot less time chasing kids down saying, oh, let me help you as they're trying to cut their clothes or whatever, because they developed the muscles necessary for the skills that they were being introduced to. So it makes using scissors in the classroom much easier for both you as the teacher and the children. Now, I'm sure you're wondering where I got the printables that I talked about in this episode. So first things first, I have a free printable scissor cutting skills checklist for you. So all you have to do, if you're watching us on YouTube, is look below the video in the video description, and there will be a link to where you can grab your free scissor skills checklist, which includes the developmental sequence. And if you're listening on your favorite podcast app, all you have to do is go to prekpages.com. That's pre-kpages.com, and type Scissor Skills Checklist into the search box. And if you liked this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube, mash that big subscribe button. Until next time, I'm Vanessa Levin. Onward and upward.